Who was Jesus? It's a great question, and people for centuries have debated who this man was. And was he just a man, or was he something more? So what we're going to be talking about today is, historically, what do we know about the person known as Jesus of Nazareth? Who was he? Where do we derive these sources from? And what can we learn about them? And how do we respond to them from a Christian viewpoint, obviously? The question is, who is Jesus, or who was Jesus? You've seen in recent years, the Da Vinci Code movies. Did he have a family after? Was he just a magician? Was it just, was it all a scam? And we'll kind of talk about today, what do we know historically from the person of Jesus Christ? Basically, when it comes down to it, you have to think about that Jesus is a Jew living in the Roman world. There's three places historically that historians will go to, societies that we know, and we can derive information about Jesus. And you need to know these three sources. The first one are the Roman sources. We can look at Roman historians, and they mention a guy named Jesus of Nazareth who was killed through crucifixion, and his followers who came after him, who believed that he had risen from the dead, and then these believers were persecuted. The second sources are the Jewish sources. I'll show you some of those here in a second, but some of the Jews went and obviously knew Jesus was a person, saw him, but they saw him as a heretic, as someone who went and violated the customs of the day. And then the third, the most obvious, are the Christian sources. When you go and you read the Bible, that's obviously talking about Jesus. So one thing I want to throw out there, and I just always explain, sometimes people say Jesus did not exist. He's a myth. He's like a Paul Bunyan or something like that. That is not historically accurate at all. We have more evidence that Jesus was a real person that lived at some time and place than many of the other historical figures that we've looked at in this class. So just keep in mind, that's just nonsense to say that there was never a guy named Jesus. There just historically was. Whether or not he was a Messiah, of course, people debate that. But there historically was a person named Jesus of Nazareth, as much as there is a person named Julius Caesar at some point. This is from Josephus. And Josephus was actually a Jew. And I'll let you pause here. I won't read it for you. But he's actually a Jew writing about Jesus. So this isn't from a Christian perspective. It's from a Jewish perspective. And Josephus obviously writes about a guy named Jesus who lived at this time. In addition, you'll see a slight variation on what happens. This is all from a Jewish source, the Talmud. They went and actually said Jesus, or Yeshua, was hanged. And traditionally think about him as crucified. But that doesn't dispute the fact that there was a guy named Jesus at some point. This story goes hand in hand with the story of Jesus. Now, the Christian sources you're probably fairly familiar with. Basically the followers of Jesus the apostles, write what we call today the Gospels, or what mean the good news, because the good news that Jesus brought to earth. And these four Gospels you need to know are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In these four Gospels, they kind of complement each other. They don't contradict each other. Some of them may emphasize some points. They may be written a little bit differently. But these four Gospels tell the same basic story of a guy named Jesus who was born in Bethlehem, raised in Nazareth, became a rabbi, and made some pretty drastic claims. And they're all going to be very, very similar when describing his death and resurrection. Your Bible just doesn't end there, though, on your New Testament. The bulk of the New Testament, a good portion of it, is written by a guy named Paul. And the thing that's cool about Paul is he has a complete transformation, and we'll talk a bit more about him. But he was a guy, he wasn't called Paul, he was called Saul before with an S. And he was an early Christian hater. And he loved to watch the Christians be persecuted, and basically had a miraculous vision and converted to Christianity. And what Paul did was he was a church planter. And Paul went all around the Mediterranean and planted churches. And when Paul planted churches, he would set up these churches, and then he would write letters, or what we call, the fancy name, are epistles, back to these churches. For example, the church in Corinth, he is called the book of Corinthians, or the church in Philippi, Philippians, Ephesus, Ephesians. That's where you get those names from. They're kind of weird names. And that's what they are. If you read them, they're letters written by Paul to these churches that he had started up, and they help define a lot of Christian doctrine. Now, some of this doctrine is listed here. This is pretty basic, like Christian 101. What do we know about Jesus from a combination of kind of these epistles from Paul and the four Gospels? We know that Jesus is God, And he is also human and descendant of David, and that's one of the prophecies that was made as well. So it's hard to logically think about, but he was both 100% human and 100% God. He had brothers later on. He had apostles. That was his crew that he traveled around with to spread the message. Instituted the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper, very symbolically, if you know, is on Passover, when you had that's the most important Jewish event, and Jesus is going to take this to a whole nother level. And instead of a lamb being slain, like we had talked about last semester, where the lamb was slain on the original Passover, Jesus becomes the lamb himself. And the body, the bread represented his body, and the wine represented his blood. He was killed by rulers, and then on the third day he rose again, following his crucifixion, reappeared, and then ascended back into heaven after he reappeared for some period of time. Now, a famous kind of argument in terms of how do we respond to this? We know for a fact, like I said, that Jesus existed. And how do we go and, as a society, react to this? You're either basically going to reject his message or not. And C.S. Lewis made the very famous argument, C.S. Lewis, the guy who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, the liar, lunatic, or Lord argument. Basically in response to some people that say, Jesus was a really good guy, and, we just need to follow and kind of be like him, kind of like, like a Gandhi type figure, like a really peaceful just guy that had a good moral message. And Lewis says you can't really do that. Logically, you have to come into one of three camps: liar, lunatic, or Lord. Liar implying that Jesus knew he wasn't the Messiah, and he basically was a con artist, so maybe his miracles were just kind of magic tricks. Lunatic meaning he was absolutely nuts. He was insane thinking he was God, and obviously occasionally you'll see that in the news. And then third, even less unlikely, but even makes more sense, is Lord, is Jesus that is the person that he claimed to be, and that's who he truly is. Cool thing to take here is actually in the Narnia book, and then later they incorporate into later Narnia movies, when Lucy goes into the world of Narnia through the closet. She comes out, and nobody's going to believe her that she's been in this miraculous world. And she talks to the professor because she's so sad, and the professor defends her using the liar, lunatic, or Lord argument that C.S. Lewis made. So you can take a look at it. It's kind of a cool thing. So there you go. The three sources that we looked at for Jesus, where we know who Jesus was, and a possible response to him.